So I will introduce our speakers for today, and then I will turn it over to Eddie, who's going to moderate. So Wib Gulley served as Durham's mayor from 1985 to 1989, where he issued the groundbreaking anti-discrimination proclamation of 1986. He later served... He later served 6 terms in the North Carolina Senate from 1993 to 2004, advocating for transportation, affordable housing, and fair elections. He was founding board chair of the regional transit agency Go Triangle and later served as its general counsel from 2004 to 2014. Gulley graduated from Duke University and Northeastern University Law School. So our moderator today is Eddie Davis. He served as a North Carolina public school teacher for nearly 40 years and later on the Durham City Council. His dedication to education, including serving as president of the North Carolina Association of Educators and on the executive committee of the National Education Association. As Durham's public historian during the city's 150th anniversary back in 2019, he has documented significant moments in Durham's civil rights journey and continues to work on historical projects across North Carolina. Mab Segrest has dedicated over 40 years to teaching, organizing, and writing about LGBTQ issues and combating white supremacy. Her work with organizations including North Carolinians Against Racist and Religious Violence and Southerners on New Ground helped integrate LGBTQ rights into broader social justice movements. She has authored 4 books and taught at Connecticut College from 2002 to 2015. After returning to Durham in 2019, she continues her commitment to social justice activism. Steve Schewel co-founded and published The Independent, now IndieWeek, from 1983 to 2013, providing a progressive voice in Durham's political landscape. He taught public policy at Duke University from 2000 to 2017, focusing on social movements and political change. He later served on the Durham City Council and 2 terms as Durham's mayor from 2017 to 2021. Schewel holds a master's degree from Columbia University and both a BA and PhD from Duke University. His long career spans journalism, academia, and public service. The Reverend Joe Harvard served as pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Durham for 33 years. As a respected faith leader in Durham for over 4 decades, he worked diligently to combat discrimination. Following Mayor Gulley's anti-discrimination proclamation in 1986, he led a significant interfaith initiative, gathering endorsements from 75 religious leaders for a published resolution supporting equal rights and protections for gay men and lesbians. His leadership helped unite Durham's faith communities behind this crucial civil rights issue. And finally, Leah Wise, an African-American activist scholar in Southern justice movements since the late 1960s, worked to combat hate violence in Durham through documentation and organizing. She was instrumental in confronting discrimination against Black workers during the KKK resurgence of 1979 to 1984. As a founding member of multiple organizations, including Southerners for Economic Justice, North Carolinians Against Racist and Religious Violence, Southern Exposure Magazine, and the National Anti-Klan Network, Wise helped establish crucial civil rights initiatives. She holds a master's degree in history from Duke University. So, thank you all to our panelists. I will now turn it over to Eddie Davis.
Thank you, Lauren. I hope I'm talking loud enough. Can you hear me? Okay, great. Great. Thank all of you all for coming. This is a wonderful discussion that we're going to have, and I want everybody to be involved with it. I want to start with a couple of questions. First of all, how many people in here were not even born in 1986? Okay, very good. Keep your hands up. And also, let's add to that list, that hand raising, of all of the people who had not yet arrived in Durham by 1986. Oh, So there are lots of people here. Thank you very much. So there are lots of people here who may not know on a first-hand basis as to the goings-on along the way. Now, of course, there are lots of people who were here. You heard the applause for 40 years and 30 years and those kind of things. So lots of us were here. Some people even were born and raised here in Durham. So it's a wonderful gathering of people that we have here. So I think that what we want to start with is with the man who brought all of this about to a large degree by his working with some of the other people on this panel to try to come up with a proclamation. And he was, at that point, the person who could make a proclamation for the full city of Durham, because he was the mayor of Durham at that time, and that's Mayor Wib Gulley. So will you...
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, everyone. It's great to be here this afternoon. It's wonderful to see so many friends and faces I know well out there. And I'm going to try and speak fast and not speak very long, which is hard as a lawyer and a former politician. Thank you, Lauren, Penny, for the library being a fabulous host for this and all the help you've given us. And the people that you see here are all really important, and they're all talented organizers and great in a variety of ways. But there's some other people that have worked to help get us this thing pulled together and well organized and on the road. Joanne Abel's been recognized, and we're grateful for her. Meredith Emmett, I tell you, hold your applause to the end. Let me get through this. But Meredith has been great every step of the way, although she has about 5,000 other things that are on her shoulders. Hooper Schultz is here, and he's great in a lot of ways, including skills I just have learned in the last week or two. Andrew Nurkin is head of the Heart Leadership Program at Duke and has been a fabulous anchor of the research effort that's gone on for a while into this story. Shelley Green, where's Shelley? Okay, there you are. Is fabulous in a bunch of helping roles, including the wonderful program you have here, designed and put together by Shelley. And Mandy Carter is not with us today. She was going to be on the panel. She wanted to be. She got caught out in a conference in a situation that prevents her from being here, but I know that she's here with us in spirit and certainly was a good part of what happened back in '86. So I wasn't going to be on this. In fact, I was intentionally denying being on the panel and didn't want to, because to me, the story of what happened in the summer of 1986 around the mayoral recall is not a story of any individual. It's a story of a community that wrestled among itself with a very difficult issue at the time in a way that went on for weeks and weeks and was very contentious, and yet came out making a decision about who we were going to be as Durham and what path we were going to take, which was to turn away, I think, from a path of narrow intolerance and one that said we're going to embrace diversity, we're going to embrace tolerance, we're going to be a different kind of place from the way a lot of folks in Durham, the way a lot of folks around us saw this community. That's the story. And we couldn't have a better group of folks up here to tell that story, because they all played wonderful and key roles in it. From the time that Mab and I believe Leah set up a meeting, and she and Mab came to see me about the proclamation. Although we're still struggling. I was going to say, and I'm vague on that, but that's memories after 40-something years. I was asked to, and I want to read the proclamation. I'll do this quickly. I know proclamations are not the most exciting thing, but this I think is a pretty good one. And this was issued the 25th day of June, 1986. It notes that whereas democracies can't exist without protecting their citizens from persecution and discrimination because of race, religion, national origin, gender, and then I added in or affectional orientation. And whereas the very basis of democracy is the right of all people to dignity and self-respect. And then whereas diversity is essential for a decent and democratic society. And then I added another whereas here. Lesbian and gay men often face discrimination in housing, employment, immigration policy, child custody, and many other parts of their lives. They're often targets of harassment, intimidation, and violent attack merely because of affectional orientation. And they've contributed to the spiritual, artistic, and civic life of our city, our state, and nation. And whereas all people have the right to love and live free of bigotry, violence, and fear in the workplace, the family, the streets of our city, our places of worship and play, our hospitals and clinics, our schools, and the privacy of their homes. Therefore, I, Wib Gulley, signed this proclamation declaring Anti-Discrimination Week in 1986. I'm glad that it still reads so well today from back then. Let me say this. I have worked for a couple of years and been helped by folks up on this panel and Andrew and folks, Hooper and folks out in the audience to research, pull together, document, and tell the story of the recall battle from the summer of 1986. It's not the only contentious issue that Durham has faced in its history. It's certainly not the only tough struggle around gay rights that Durham has faced. But I felt, in some ways, it was more crucial to what the community of Durham became in the years that followed than what you folks tend to think of around other urban communities in America, where they'll talk about, oh, this company moved to town, you know, Microsoft moved to Seattle or Apple moves, and that's what really makes the community. Steve and I got invited to talk over the last number of years about what happened. For Steve, it was more recently. For me, it was back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. And when we were mayor, and how did Durham become what it is today, at least in the good ways of what it is today, a community that I think has a high quality of life, embraces tolerance and diversity, and celebrates it. And I think more than anything else, the story of what happened in the summer of 1986 was the key pivotal point for that. I also had found from talking with some younger folks in Durham that the story was almost completely forgotten, which was interesting to me. So it is a story of great importance for Durham, I think. Also, and I say this with very mixed feelings, but I believe it's a story that has great importance to our nation today. It's a story where communities may be struggling to try and come to terms with what's going on. I think Durham can provide some insight on that, and that we can understand that if we not just accept, but embrace and celebrate diversity and tolerance, that doesn't just help some people. Actually, everyone in Durham enjoys a great quality of life and a relative economic prosperity, I think, because of the path that we took. So that's why I think it's a great story. I'm looking forward to hearing our panel and see how our history can help us all learn to stand up today.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the proclamation. In the early 80s, there were two buildings that you expected good organizing to come out of. One was the building that housed the Gulley law practice, and in that same building, two people who are on this panel had offices. One of them is Mab Segrest. She was there, and I'm sure she bumped into Wib a lot and maybe had a lot to do, along with Leah and many other people, with trying to get this proclamation started. So, Mab, why don't you give us some background on that discussion?
Well, I'm very happy to be here today. It does seem like the old band is back together. There may be several bands back together in this room, but I'm also glad that so many people were not here in '86. So it's both old hat and new hat. And I just want to explain, I got these glasses on because I have dry eye and light sensitivity, but also I'm aspiring to be a rapidly aging white lesbian Stevie Wonder. And I am glad I came back to Durham. Brooklyn was so boring. I add my appreciation to Wibs and Eddie's and other panelists for all of you who came out this afternoon for a discussion of Durham at the Crossroads 40 years ago. This event is built around our memories and records of the Pride March of '86, of Mayor Gulley's signing the anti-discrimination proclamation the week of the march, the vehement campaign to recall Mayor Gulley by a coalition of conservative religious leaders, some of whom we might consider now Christian nationalists. And given that the recall campaign happened 4 decades ago, our memories and interpretations may not be 100% consistent with each other or ourselves. So thankfully, they can be fact-checked in the archives, which Mandy Carter exquisitely organized, and our younger historians like Hooper Schultz, who can remind us of them. It was not in any original plans for this event, as I understand it, that we would hold it less than a week after Donald Trump was inaugurated in his second term as President of the United States. It was not in our plans that it would be a week in which he set out to reverse the very rights, relationships, and manifestations of decency that Durham folks affirmed in the late summer of 1986. So we are right on time. So we will tell you a story of that summer's events, what led to them, and what they produced. For some of you younger folks, or who are new to our peculiar southern ways or Durham, it may seem a story from the land before time. From a story of phone booths and books called atlases that contained paper maps by which you could navigate your car. It was a time of poignant and heartbreaking memorial services at the Unitarian Church or Duke Garden for our friends dying of AIDS. A time before the cocktails that for many who had access to them made AIDS livable. It was a time of sodomy laws that made us Class H felons across the South. That's a possible 10-year sentence. And that law was struck down as late as 2002, but still lives in the devious minds of SCOTUS. It was a time before gay marriage, 215, and gays in the military, Clinton's in the 90s. Before diversity and equity and inclusion programs existed, as they did last week, but they do not this week. And even sexual orientation and understandings of gender beyond male-female binaries were included. It was a time before we knew ourselves by both our names and our pronouns. It was not a time before lesbians seized the means of reproduction with turkey basters, sterile artichoke jars, and David Jolly sperms. To make our own babies and our own families. You know who you are. It was a time before. To me, the story of the recall and its defeat is a story of that door, that portal, that opening, when a community decides to stand up for itself, when we ask a new, straight, and very cute mayor to stand with us, and he agreed. When we march to a different slogan of here today, here to stay, not our day out, from 5 years before. When those in our city who called us by the most vile names came after us to put our genie back in the bottle. When people across the city rallied to support Wib, to take a stand with us, and to win. Other panelists can relate a big part of the win was a huge expression of civic engagement and dialogue across all the city that I have not experienced before or since. Recall, the mayor tables popped up like mushrooms at all the places of worship, street corners, malls, at sports events, and very soon there are our table, our forces right beside them, engaged in a range of conversations about deeply contentious issues and fears and views of God. And there was that city council meeting in which all of both sides crammed into the council chambers with God and heaven and hell and rights and pride, and a lot of pomade from the hairs of some of the white preachers sloshed around. But we never came to blows. No one threw a punch, and no one contested the election. It was a land before this time. So each of us on the panel and many in the auditorium may remember when and where we entered this remarkable set of events. My own memory puts me in Wib's office, which is downstairs from our office. I don't remember Leah being there. She doesn't remember, but Wib does, so it all happened. And it was a downtown in which you could always find a parking space. It was my second year as coordinator of North Carolinians Against Racist and Religious Violence, from which we were organizing against the worst Klan and Nazi movement in the country in North Carolina. When I was hired as coordinator, I shared with the board of mostly African-American organizers, several of them radical preachers, that I was a homosexual felon under North Carolina law, and they hired me anyway. I urge Leah Wise here today and the chair of the NCARV board for us to include homophobic violence in the list we were assembling of racist and religious acts of speech, assault, and murder. She said document it, and I think I've been doing that ever since. So by 1986, NCARV staff and members, supporters consisted of those groups who had been, whose people had been in the camps, if you know what I mean. Black and brown people, queers, Jews, women, a list to which I would add today Palestinians, immigrants, and the list will go on. All of whom recognize the urgency of the moment and the dangers of such movements going viral, as we would say today. Perhaps we were premature anti-fascists. Nationally and locally, we recognized the wedge issues being sown by those who would repress or destroy us all, that we needed to stay together when such attacks occurred, in which the church would be in the center, which in the recall they did and were. I'm grateful that my part of this generation was shaped by the Combahee River Collective Statement of Black Feminists out of Boston in 1978. And in the Triangle by UNC women grad students, including Minnie Bruce Pratt, who in 1969 organized for women's rights that would morph and struggle later into transgender rights and the rights of children and adults to be in their own bodies and spirits. It was a Duke Gay Alliance, as I understand it, that in the 1970s founded Triangle area lesbian feminists to whom I owe the rest of my life, that they had the remarkable soybean casseroles and activism, such as supporting imprisoned women in Raleigh when they protested for better prison conditions. It was Joe Herzenberg, the first elected gay official in North Carolina, on the Chapel Hill Town Council, and John Bodie and the gay guys in Raleigh who were working on sodomy law reform. It was Joanne Abel and Nancy Blood, who by then were librarians at the Durham County Library, whose experiences in the women in print movement helped, I think, shape Nancy's Whole Women Press that produced our own text. And Joanne, who had lived in the Koinonia radical community in Georgia in the 60s and went to Segrest, the first feminist theory confab in DC with Charlotte Bunch and Rita Mae Brown. And so Joanne and Nancy were in place at the library to put up the exhibit of gay and lesbian books for that pride and the proclamation that a member of one of the fundamentalist churches took to her preacher, and the battle was on. This is to say that none of us came to these moments unprepared. The recall campaign and that Pride March didn't just drop out of the sky. We were hardly the Rosa Parks sitting down in the front of the bus, but we were standing up and we were ready. And I think it's important to get this larger context as well as the excellent timeline that's in your program of the more very constricted events that year to understand like what organizing is and how we get ready for it. So we took Wib the proclamation, and Joanne and Nancy decorated the library bulletin board, and we had our Pride March. Opposition launched the recall battle, and the battle was on. And then there was Lady Slipper Music, Mail Order Operation, which Laurie Fuchs ran with the largest collection of women's music in the world. And Adrienne Rich did a benefit for NCARV at the synagogue. And we were emboldened and enlivened by the amazing concerts that Lady Slipper sponsored with lesbian troubadours, and Mandy would organize Rhythm Fest in the mountains with these huge porta-janes that Annie was most impressed by the amount of poop there was in them. We took her. And then we got to hear the incomparable Sweet Honey in the Rock, whose a cappella concerts gave us a soundtrack for our times then and now. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until we win, until the killing of a black man, a black mother's son, is as important as the killing of a white man, a white mother's son, or daughter, or child. And what about no killing of anybody? We will not bow down to racism. We will not bow down to discrimination or oppression. And the revered Audre Lorde instructed us, your silences will not save you. Today in our time, the red hat signifies that they will go back to any awful practice from any previous time that they damn well please, unless we stop them. But we get to decide what time this is, what our lives are that we will live. We will stop them once, and we can stop them again. So today, in remembering the recall and its defeat and the victory of the Pride March and Proclamation, is a time of opening, of mobilization and solidarity and decency and organizing that led to Pride Marches every year, medications for AIDS, into sodomy laws, getting married and divorced, and having our children and grandchildren, 2 generations since then, and elected officials, even if the gerrymandered institutions, still a lot of work to do. We will not bow down. We who believe in freedom will not fail. So thanks for coming.
Wonderful lead-off discussion there, Mab. Thank you so much for sharing that information. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of background about some of the things that were going on and how that relates to where we are today. Now, the gay and lesbian community here led the charge going to Mayor Gulley, but there were many allies along the way who helped out along the way. Steve Schewel is one of those, was and is one of those allies. Steve.
Thank you very much, Eddie. Before I get started, I thought Laurie and Nancy, raise your hands. You got a great shout out from Mab, but you need a shout out from everybody. And Joanne. And Joanne. I want to start with this quote from the Durham Morning Herald a few days before Wib signed the proclamation. This was from the lead editorial in the Herald. There is a fine line between showing the courage of one's convictions and brain damage. Mayor Wib Gulley is about to cross that line. Go Wib. And the editorial ended like this. And if political suicide is his yen, then Mayor Gulley should be able to find worthier causes with which to lynch himself. Okay, first of all, Wib, thank you for crossing that line and showing the courage of your convictions. And then, of course, the editorial could not have predicted the future more inaccurately. Wib got elected again the next year to his second term as mayor, and then subsequently elected to the 6 terms in the North Carolina Senate. And already Durham had moved beyond the hateful ideology expressed in this editorial, although, as we know, there was plenty of it around. And then, of course, there's the use of the word lynch, a word that's freighted with such a violent racist history. And this editorial writer definitely knew what he was doing. And so that's part of what was going on. And finally, this editorial isn't just a reasoned disagreement about policy. It's a screed. It's an angry, hate-filled yelp that reminds me of the language that we read today in the attacks on trans people and their allies and advocates. The far right always aims to hate its hate at somebody. And now it's our trans friends and neighbors, our immigrant friends and neighbors, and our refugee friends and neighbors who are bearing the brunt of this vitriol. But I have to say, with our current Congress and President and Supreme Court, even victories that we thought were secure are in danger. I saw today that the Idaho legislature, can you imagine what that's like, wants the Supreme Court to revoke marriage equality. I don't believe that's going to happen, but it's out there. So I think of the effort to recall Wib in 1986, the Pride March that took place amidst this political turmoil, and the organizing to stop the recall as a time of danger. A time of danger to Wib as an elected official, danger to our vision of a progressive Durham, and danger most of all to our lesbian and gay residents. But I also think of it as a time of joy and a time, as Mab said, of victory. We won. We won. It's hard to win. We won. Let me talk a little bit about the joy. Take a look at this photo behind me. Lauren's going to put up. Two young adults with their 2-month-old baby. Yeah, that's me without the gray hair, and Leo and Abe in the front pack at the Pride March. This photo was taken at the end of the march down at the reservoir on Hillsborough Road, where there used to be a city rec center. The day was hot as hell. It was the hottest day, well, that year, and every year we get hotter days. But it was very, very hot. There were hundreds of us, and my LGBTQ plus friends can say better than I how amazing it was for so many people to be together and to be out together. But for allies, it was amazing as well. And it's important to remember that when the recall effort began, we sprung into action and we organized. We had a progressive infrastructure, as Mab has described very well, gay and lesbian organizations and institutions, and many other allied organizations ready to take on the fight. I found a strategy memo that I wrote to our steering committee. We had a group called the Durham Committee for Responsible Leadership. There's a boring name for you, but I guess we wanted it that way. And I found this memo I wrote to our steering committee of the organization we formed on the fly to fight the recall. This all happened in a very, very compressed timeline. Meredith did a great timeline. It's very, very compressed. And I enjoyed reading this. It's 5 pages of specifics about the actions we were taking just 1 week out from the formation of the group. We were moving in a hurry. And what I read here is that we did the kind of grassroots organizing that Durham has been known for forever. From the textile workers in 1934 to the to the Free Palestine movement of what are we today, 2025. Thank you. And I want to read one paragraph from this memo. It's about tabling. Our goal was to have a table next to every table that the recall advocates put up to gather signatures. We wanted to tell people why not to sign the petition. So let me read you this one paragraph. Tabling, leafleting. Some great organizing has been done here, with some 25 people leafleting in several parts of town this weekend, with 4 or 5 tables staffed by our folks every day. That will continue through this week. Carol Anderson. Hey, Carol. Carol says that our tabling folks cruise until they find a petitioner's table and then locate next to them. Reports are that the petitioners' tables are still up, but only sporadically, and that our tables are really often having an effect on people thinking about signing the petition. It forces them to think twice, and that's often enough. It's clear from reports from our folks that the petitioners' ability to get signatures is slowing down. They often get only a couple in an hour. They're already hit their few thousand naturals, and now they're going to find the signatures tougher and tougher to get. We all know, because we've done petition drives a million times before, I wrote. They need to average 500 per day, and we know they did not average 500 per day, but those tables went up next to all of their tables, and that was the kind of, just very, very basic grassroots organizing that we were doing. We raised money. We raised it $10 at a time. $50 was a major donation. Our total raise was $3,000. And with that money, we ran newspaper ads in the Herald and Carolina Times, which is the Black Weekly. We printed leaflets, and we ran radio ads. We did it by getting on the phone and calling people, which still works, by the way, if you're a Durham person calling another Durham person instead of a robocaller. We ran radio ads with the voices of Joe Harvard, whom we wanted for his beautiful Southern lilt, with Eddie Davis, then a deeply respected and beloved teacher at Hillside High School, with Carolyn McAllister, a young Durham lawyer, and Coyne Page, a young Durham doctor, with the late and amazing Chuck Davis. So as I was reading this memo, I need to add a mea culpa. I was kind of shocked when I read it because I felt I was a little bit like Jefferson Griffin, who is currently trying to steal the Supreme Court election from Justice Allison Riggs, as we know. In this memo, I discussed our strategy for challenging voter signatures on the recall petitions. Didn't they have to sign their name exactly as they were registered? Didn't they have to have the right address? And how much time would they receive to cure their ballot if they had the wrong address? I remember going down to City Hall along with City Council member Tom Campbell to discuss this with our Assistant City Attorney, Karen Sindelar. I have to say that Tom and I were arguing on behalf of disqualifying signatures. This is the truth. And Karen was telling us, hell no. She was right, of course. Another example of why our city attorney's office, by the way, has always been and remains so excellent. I don't see Karen here, but Paige, maybe you can tell her that I apologize. So there I was on the right side of history doing the wrong thing. Here's the final thing I'll say about our organizing. It drew out people I'd never seen before among our ranks, and Mab mentioned this. Durham was an activist hotbed in 1986, for sure. But when we formed Durham Citizens for Responsible Leadership and began the leafleting and tabling, all kinds of new people poured in to help. I remember Tony Adenolfi. Tony doesn't live in Durham anymore, an AIDS nurse who came to our first meeting and took on a leadership role organizing health workers against the recall. I remember, very surprising to me, my former English professor, John Clum, who I never knew was gay, walking into that room ready to leaflet and table. We didn't know if we would win, but we put everything into the effort. Whenever I think of organizing efforts like this, most especially the ones we are engaged in now, as this country lurches Trumpward, I think of one of my favorite quotations, the one I first read in Mab's wonderful book, My Mama's Dead Squirrel. And it's not just a book with a great title, but it's a great book, which you need to read if you haven't. And the quote is from the great Southern anti-lynching and civil rights advocate, Lillian Smith. To believe in something not yet proved and to underwrite it with our lives is the only way to keep the future open. In 1986, we were believing in something not yet proved. We were believing in a new Durham, one with progressive values, a city for all. We were believing in equal rights for gay and lesbian people, and as the Pride March displayed so powerfully, we were also believing in their liberation. And we underwrote it with our lives. So the main thing about this panel that I can tell you is we're old. But we're still fighting. And I hope we have some wisdom to confer, but we need to now turn this work, the leadership of this work, over to a new generation of progressive young people in Durham, including those in this room, and to keep the future open. So thank you all very much for having me, and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you so much for many of the other things you've done. Those folks who raised their hands indicating that they were not born in 1986 recognize that the Durham Expressway runs all the way through Durham. But at one point it didn't. It stopped at Swift Avenue. And you may know that Steve and Paul Lupke, I see Theo is here, many other people around Durham tried to make sure that there were communities that did not get wiped away, like the Brookstown community got wiped away here in Durham. Many of us know about communities that were saved by the organizing that went. Carol, you were involved in all of that, trying to make sure that things did not go. Margaret Keller, here she is right here. Former city council person, women's equality person, all kinds of things along the way. Were you about to say something? Okay. There will be time for you to say something later on. And speaking of Margaret Keller, the ads that went in the newspapers that we will talk about in just a minute was not the first time that Durham organized by having full-page ads in the Durham Morning Herald and the Durham Sun at the time. In fact, Margaret Kelly and many other people did the same thing in the early parts of the 60s when they were trying to make sure that there was public accommodations that did not discriminate by race. So there were lots of people who did that, Margaret Keller being among them. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. But Steve, thank you for the wonderful things that you did and the work that you continue to do. Just to give a little context, he mentioned Tom Campbell. Some of you may not know about him, but if you've ever been in the Regulator bookstore, Tom Campbell was one of the organizers of that. Let's talk now about the recall and the things that went on. There were many people in the religious community, in the conservative religious community, that led this effort to try to recall the mayor. But that was counteracted by the work of Joe Harvard and many other people by making sure that the religious communities in Durham had their say, and that the things that people were seeing in the recall effort were not the only religious people who were out there who were trying to do things. So Joe Harvard, the floor is yours. Why don't you talk about that and any other thing related to this subject?
Thank you very much, Eddie. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Well, I'm so honored to be on this panel. I'm probably the least of those who contributed, but I did what I could. My experience began one morning when I got up and went out and picked up the newspaper. Remember what newspapers were? They used to throw them in our driveway. I went out and picked up the Durham Morning Herald, and I opened it up, and the headline of the Durham Morning Herald said, "Religious leaders oppose Mayor Gulley's proclamation and want a recall." And I thought to myself as I was walking back into the house, hey, you know, I think I may be a religious leader in Durham. And I don't oppose Mayor Gulley's recall. I really didn't know Will very well at the time, but I knew what he was doing and was very supportive. So I went back in, and after I had my breakfast, I picked up the phone, and I called Rabbi John Friedman, who was, John Friedman and I came to Durham the same year in 1980. He came to be the Rabbi Judeo Reform congregation. So I called John up and I said, John, have you been reading what's going on with this recall thing? And he said, yeah, isn't it terrible? And I said, yeah. I said, well, I think we ought to do something about it. You're a religious leader. I'm one. We don't oppose Mayor Gulley. He said, you're right. Let's do something about it. I said, okay, but wait a minute. We need some representation from the African American community in Durham if our protest is going to go somewhere. So I called up my friend Bishop Elroy Lewis, who came into Durham the same year. It was a bad year for Durham. John and Elroy now, all three came the same year to our church, to our congregations. So I called up Bishop Lewis and I said, Bishop Lewis, do you see what's going on in this recall thing? He said, yeah. He said, doesn't sound good, does it? And I said, no. I said, well, how do you feel about it? He said to me, and I'll never forget this, he said, Joe, there are a lot of different opinions in the African American community about homosexuality, but there's no difference of opinion about civil rights. He says, we think everybody ought to have their civil rights. And I said, good. So you'll work with us then? And he said, I'll be glad to. So the three of us got together and we pulled together other leaders. And before long, we had a proclamation. We had 75 religious leaders, and we went public. We took out an ad in the newspaper. It was on the radio and television. And you're right, Steve, my southern accent won some votes, I think. Anyway, I was a new pastor at First Presbyterian Church. I mean, I'd been there just 6 years. So I wasn't really sure about how my congregation was going to react to me being so public on this issue. So at the time, in the Presbyterian Church, we have something called a personnel committee. And the personnel committee oversees the work of the pastors and the other members of the staff. And the chairman of our personnel committee was a doctor at Duke, a doctor named Dr. Charles Hammond. Charles Hammond was head of OBGYN for 25 years at Duke. He developed a very wonderful procedure for doing ovarian cancer surgery that cut the death rate, the mortality rate, from 85% to 16%. And he became a figure not only here, but he was also honored in England. Well, he was a very powerful person, and he was head of the personnel committee. So not soon after all this started, one day my secretary called me and said, Dr. Hammond is on the phone for you. I said, uh-oh, what's going on now? And he said, Joe, he said, I've been watching what you're doing, reading the newspaper, seeing what was on the radio and television. There's a little pause. And he said, and I just want you to know, we got your back. And I said, all right, it's going to be all right. Anyway, that was a very positive moment for me. I had some really interesting things happen that you might be interested in. You've heard about the tables. Well, one day I was leaving First Presbyterian Church with a friend to walk down the street for lunch. We were going to a restaurant called Sudi's. Everybody remembers Sudi's. Sudi's was the only really good eating place downtown, and it was a gathering place for a lot of people in downtown Durham. Well, there was a table right across from the church, and evidently we hadn't gotten our table up there yet. It was only to support the recall, and they said, Pastor, will you sign our petition? And I said, no. I said, I'm actually on the other side. They looked at me like, what in the world's wrong with you? And so I walked on down the street. On another occasion, someone knocked on my door, my front door, and I opened the door, and it was a man and a woman, and they said, we want to talk to you because we want you to sign a petition recalling Mayor Gulley. And the woman worked for one of the law offices down here, and I'd met her somewhere, maybe at Sudi's, but somewhere. So, and she recognized me, but the man didn't. So he started into a spiel. Now, we think this is immoral, and we think it's going to destroy our community and all this. And she looks at me, she said, it's not going to work. It's not going to go anywhere with this guy. And finally, when he finished, I said, I am not in favor of what you're promoting. Good night. And they left. Anyway, it was a very interesting time, but it turned out that the majority of this community supported Mayor Gulley and supported the rights of our gay and lesbian neighbors. And it was a significant moment, I think. I think it was a moment that moved us forward. The question that I have for us today is, where do we go from here? It's Martin Luther King's famous question, but we're facing very perilous times when the rights of gays and lesbians and migrants and so many people are under attack. And I think it's a time for us to think very seriously, not only to remember and to be grateful for what happened in 1986, but what's going to happen in 2025 as we are called upon to protect those same rights that we were almost taken for granted, and now they're no longer secure. So thank you for being here. Thank you for listening to me. And let's work together to make sure where we go from here is as positive as what happened in 1986. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Harvard. Thank you for the work that you've done. And the names you called out, that Friedman, Harvard, and Lewis, some people call them the three wise men. Leah Wise, you've been around. You've seen all kinds of things. You have the ability to make all kinds of discussions and put things in context. Would you do that now for us?
Well, I'll do my best. Hello, good afternoon, and I really am grateful for all of you being here. I was kind of late in the game coming to this table, but I was excited about coming because of what's happening now and the importance of trying to learn some lessons from past struggles, this one we're talking about today being one. But I want to talk to you today as an organizer, but I'm retired, and I want you to realize I have absolutely no organizing capacity at this point. But I have a lot of lessons to share. But the first I want to do is to lift up several people in this room. One is Jim Lee over here, who is the only person I knew before I got to North Carolina and who was a partner in many of the crimes we attempted. And the other is my granddaughter over here and her colleagues from Hillside High School. Would you please stand? My granddaughter is the vice president of Hillside, and it's very important that we have young people know what's happening now, especially with the effort for them to be denied any knowledge of their history. So one of the things they asked us to focus on was where did we kind of take what we got from this particular struggle. But first I want to say a few things about Durham in the context of Durham at the time, because it's not the community that you're now involved with and witnessing. And I have so many different aspects to bring up to you. But the first thing I want to say is the moment that this activity began built on a legacy of organizing in this town, particularly around racial justice issues. And also around, I was here not only addressing those, but I was working with Southerners for Economic Justice, and our effort was to bring civil rights into Southern workplaces, and we were involved in the most anti-labor context that you anywhere in the South, the worst. And so I'm saying this because it's important to realize, given where we are now, that much of what we did at this time was in a context of absolute hostility that we faced on many fronts. And so partly what I want to say from, like, when they asked us to write a little resume, I was like, it'll take all my time to say the things I've done for the last 35 years. But I've had a lot of experience following this to build coalitions, networks, international, regional, a lot of partnership with the religious community, the World Council of Churches, the National Council of Churches, and primarily focusing on generating support and learning from grassroots communities of color. And I'm saying all this to say there's a lot of lessons that have come from this intentional effort to bring people together to be able to work together. When we are in a country that has the most racist cultural climate and political climate that has fractured every movement we've had in this country. And that became very apparent to me when I was in India and was listening to some of the struggles that workers were involved in there. And I was like, man, they have such unity. They're such clear focus. And it just made me reflect on, and this was like 1980, when was it, 84. This is really after the, 85, after the Bhopal explosion happened. But it was so clear how people abroad assume the U.S. is big, it's got money, they all mostly think it's white and rich, but they think the movement here is strong and have no understanding of how weak we are because of how fractured racism has made things. And this is some of the things I want to talk about because some of the learnings is how do we overcome this. But the first is to recognize how this has penetrated our own psyche, how much bad behavior we have, how much of our mindsets have imbibed many of the same kind of ideas that have isolated victims, criminalized them, punished them, wanting to eliminate them. That's the Nazi in the far right. And that we've had in the past, nobody talks about segregation like this was our fascist era, but it was our fascist era. And we fought through it. So I want to go back to that because these times right now look pretty horrific. And to me, the worst part is, because I'm old and I don't get all this technology, but what this technology is presented that we now have brainwashing happening to the body politic and no ability to figure out how to curtail that, of AI being able to produce, quote, facts, quote, pictures that are all lies. I mean, this is a challenge to organizing that I never had to confront at this level. And so y'all have a lot of work to do to think about, to be creative about this. But the point is, it's important to understand your organizing environment when you begin to try to work as a community. And to me, the challenge that we have today is this community being able to work together to figure out how will we be safe as a community? How will we lift each other up as a community? And there's a lot of strategy and experience that's happened over years about how to get there, but it's not the kind of experiences most people organizing the community have. And so these are some of the things I want to lift up. But the first one I want to talk about is, which was so critical to our work, is understanding the relationship of the organization of the economy to social justice issues, and how much the level of exploitation, the level of capital penetration, the level of really increasingly profit margins and the penetration of outside capital, particularly just right around the time of this, like reading about 84, there was this whole leverage buyout movement happening in North Carolina. So there are these Wall Street firms not having any experience of managing any industries, buying up companies, taking their profit, and letting them go. That happened a lot in North Carolina. Durham was a working class town. We had a manufacturing base, not only because Duke was still the primary employer, but what it meant was there was a base of people here, particularly in the Black community, who had industrial experience, which meant discipline, organization. They had resources that enabled them to have churches, community homes, unlike today. So the point is, there was a capacity and experience that this community had that played into this campaign. Interestingly, many people in this room knew nothing about that. And it speaks to the challenge which I think has increased since the 80s, of how our work has become more in silos, certainly funders funded that way, and the effort to learn what is the reality in our community takes intentional effort. And so if we are to come together to do anything together, we have to start with the knowledge of what is our base reality. And so I'm saying that because when I guess, did I hire you in 84? I think it was, well, we started NCARB like really in 83, but it was the pivotal moment in terms of social justice movement work in this area came after the Greensboro murders. And at that time, many organizations, there was a lot of sectarianism and stuff. People weren't talking to each other, hadn't done anything together in 10 years. But it was seen as such a threat of what the implication was that people came together. But it was hard work. It was not easy. And then the issue was what we've learned from building upon that. And so at that time, I think I came into the leadership of the effort to have what became a national march of 10,000 people. Me and Pat Bryant organized the Triangle Vigil Committee here in Durham to build a protest to that march. Well, after those days, 2 years later, then there surfaces these attacks on black workers who either had filed discrimination complaints, one was a cop here in Durham, or had applied for or become supervisors in, quote, white jobs. And they became the direct target of the Klan. They burned crosses, they shot into their homes, and more we found these examples happening across the state. And one of the national outcomes of the Greensboro protest marches was the National Anti-Klan Network, which both Mab and I were on leadership of. And it was documenting what was happening. Well, at the same time, while I was at Southerners for Economic Justice, we were also documenting the plant closings that had begun to happen in North Carolina and Durham. And so I'm saying to you to recognize how, at the time, this is when, like in 1979, where the steel mills got blown up in Ohio, and there was this whole wave of deindustrialization and plant closings. And so the effect on this town was a very strong economic base, the working class, and there were many struggles around race and discrimination in those workplaces, but it got kind of wiped away. So people were, at like a dissonance place. So to me, the fact that this effort to respond to the proclamation and wanting to lift up the anti-discrimination proclamation was very important in the black community, to have a public official voice proclaim anti-discrimination in a city that had been very discriminatory in the black community, usurping resources, property. I mean, there were lots of battles. So what I want to share with you, because what we tried to do, part of my role at that time was really going into the homes of many black organizers and community members, tenant groups, to talk about why this proclamation struggle and this recall of Wib was such an important struggle. And the reason I say this is that people were really clear on the discrimination part, and also many felt hampered around their own sense of theology that, gee, this is an abomination. Am I supporting, upholding those that are contrary to my faith? So the thing that I learned from this experience is directly talking to people in their homes, in their families about, let's start talking about our families first. Who's in our families? And so I'm saying this because we learned and practiced a lot after this struggle of taking up, addressing homophobia within our constituencies as we move forward. So anytime we're talking about issues of discrimination, exploitation, oppression, it's a constituency that's also important. And it was the most difficult of the work we did. And later on, when immigration came and there was major conflicts around that, it was still the principle of you start where people are. You lift up where they are and where they can be together. I was a member of the Chuck Davis Dance Company. One of the most important things that I think we did as a company was Chuck had us performing in communities across the state, but also in many neighborhoods here in Durham. And what he did was he made the people who came to see us behave as a community. He taught them what it meant to me to be a community, how to lift each other, how to chant peace, love, and respect for everybody, how to participate. And so, interestingly, in some of the most Eastern North Carolina racist communities, hey, people responded. So the lesson was, if you create an affirming space for people to learn and begin to learn how to lift each other up, you can bring people forward. But there are a lot of principles that need to come with that, and I just want to talk about a couple of those things. So one is when you're bringing in, and the intent is having diverse groups of people, the first is to think about you have to learn to appreciate and respect and honor the diversities in room, means the differences in the room, not try to hide them, which a lot of union campaigns used to do, but to negotiate diversities and the tremendous complexities in our society. That is a critical piece. And then to try to look at the big picture and the micro picture at the same time, as well as short-term and long-term work. What is the vision that's uniting us? And the most important thing is learning to practice how to lift each other up, how to have principles that allow us to have mutual, what do we call it? Mutual benefit to the work we're doing, mutual participation, mutual leadership. And that's not a way many of our organizations, to be honest, function. And particularly when you think about the struggle about democracy. Here we are, many nonprofit organizations and churches that people control, but have some of the worst democratic practice you can imagine. If we're to build democracy, we have to practice it. And so one of the, I don't know how this came to be. I think maybe it was the time when we were celebrating in one of our, this one network we had that we were celebrating women organizers. And we asked people to bring a picture of themselves, the women that we were going to put on the wall to honor. And we asked the women to write a statement of legacy about them, their work. And we asked the men to bring pictures of women they wanted to honor. And no women could come up to speak to their legacy. And we realized, I mean, I'm talking about some brilliant organizers who've been out there a long time. And then we realized that we're so used to like just moving on that we did not celebrate ourselves and what we were doing and what we needed to do. And so I'm saying that the things that the lessons of that there are ways that what Chuck has spoken to is you can create an environment where you can learn to lift each other up, and that's how you can learn to work. But you also, you've heard some of the stories about the documentation that we did. It's important to know on the ground, in the neighborhood, street by street, what and who is being impacted, and how then you reach and lift them and engage them in the work for the community's survival. So this is what I want to kind of offer to you. There's a whole lot of other things that I could say about this work, but just to know that the work to be together has to be intentional. It has to be transformative. It means you're going to be in uncomfortable situations and uncomfortable environments, but to learn, because what's coming down on us now is not allowing us to do things in silos. We will not survive. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leah. Let's give the entire panel a round of applause. I've found that sometimes the most instructive and beneficial aspect of programming is to hear from the people we've been talking to. So this may be a good time to ask if there are comments or questions that you'd like to raise. I see a hand over here.
I'm assuming back then, People's Alliance, Durham Committee, Friends of Durham existed in 1986. Where were they in all of this?
And Steve can also say some of that. Probably everybody can. The People's Alliance voted to support the effort to fight the recall. The Durham Voters Alliance did as well, is my memory. I don't remember the Durham Committee taking a position, Eddie. I'm going to look to you to.
I'm not sure if there was an affirming position made at that point.
Yeah.
So Jennifer McGovern, who's sitting right back here, spoke for the People's Alliance at the press conference that happened the day before the Pride March, which was right after the proclamation had been signed.
And she was only 5 years old.
I want to say I was reading through the Carolina Times, some of the articles, and this was dated in August of '86, and letters to the editor. And I was surprised to see a reference that the committee had supported this, because I didn't know that. So I think that, I don't know, how that vote was official, but that it was definitely recorded there.
I actually have a related question. That's why I thought I would just go next. Yeah, because I'm curious about sorry, what was the boring name you said, Steve? The Durham Citizens for Responsible Leadership. So, like, when I look at this and I think about what you see now, you see logos. So a lot of logos. And so I don't see that here. So I'm like curious in terms of organizing at that time. How did you decide who was on the steering committee? Why did you call it that? And I also just want to point out, which I think is kind of hilarious, is 682-7777 is still the People's Alliance number. So if you call that number and you want to volunteer, it's going to ring and it's in my purse right now.
Steve, you can speak.
Wib said I need to do something, Laura. I need to do something. This thing? It's on. Oh, it's on. Okay, hi. Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. I don't have any idea how we came up with the name, and I don't know who did it, and I think the steering committee was the people that showed up. I think that's what it was. We didn't have logos, but we did seek endorsements from lots and lots of different organizations, and that list is somewhere on one of the leaflets. There's a big. That's the way we did it. I don't know that the organizations had all the logos back then. Not sure. Were logos a thing? Probably were. Yeah, but it was like it came together real fast. And I would say very spontaneously, and not with a lot of forethought, I would say.
Steve, can I add a quick word to this? I mean, there were several folks who were driving forces in the organizing to fight the recall. And it was partook of the spirit of the times, which is very different from now. Back then, I don't know whether or not logos or whatever. It was like some young troublemakers. How do you speak to the Durham community that's out there that we want to get their support? And you don't say, gay, lesbian, wild, crazy, other people. You look for something that sounded as staid and whatever, and that's what you came up with is responsible leadership. But that was meant to say that gray, boring thing was everybody pulling together, and I thought it was great. I mean, the first time I ran, I've always been Wib Gulley, right? Said, no, you have to list your name, Wilbur P., quote, Wib, quote, Gulley. And I hated it. And after the first time I ran, I never did it again. But that was how people did it back then. So,
You know what?
also.
Yeah, Carol, go ahead, say it again.
Well, no, there's nothing more to say. Mark Hellman was part of that whole steering committee, and yeah, I'm certain it was the two of you, Steve. So, and it was the most boring name we could come up with.
It was.
Also, I mean, it's very instructive for me to hear all of the People's Alliance side of it and the campaigning side of it, because even though the lesbian, gay, queer community was deeply organized ourselves, we never would have had this kind of reach. You know, we never would have had this kind of reach. And just the proclamation, and then that Wib had to get defended when they had just gotten him elected, you know, like turned it into a whole different ballgame, and all that organizing expertise, and call up Joe Harvard and call it, you know, like all of that kind of stuff, we wouldn't have been able to do. So I'm really appreciating that kind of nexus that happened and how much y'all kind of brought the forces out, not only to protect Wib, but also to protect Wib. So.
It was an honor.
Eddie, let me ask you a question. How long did they have to get the number of petitions? What was the process?
Yeah, I think that's the case, and there was a cutoff point, and then there was a verification of the signatures to make sure that they matched the voter registration, those kind of things. Yes.
Okay, comment. So, as somebody who was 19 when I came out in Durham, you know, I'm appreciating on a new level today how I came out into this community where the first Pride March, which I was part of organizing, was probably at least half straight people. You know, and one of the things I remember is the Leonard Peltier Support Committee banner, you know, who is free now, or somewhat more free. You know, and that's what it was like. It wasn't just a bunch of lesbian and gay people having a parade, you know, which I'm queer, I'm not against that, but it was like inherently political, just completely from the get-go. And what I didn't realize until today, like most of y'all are straight up there on the panel. You know, it was allies, like I have always assumed that sense of allyship and the deep history that's all part of what y'all have been talking about, the unions and everything. Civil rights movement that was so crucial to Durham. So that's all.
Well, and Betsy, you were on the call. You were on the part of the group that made the call for the march. I saw your name there. And I was also thinking, Leah mentioned Jim. Jim was the person that recorded our radio ads, Jim Lee. So not only has he done a lot, but he did a lot for this. So.
I just want to. Is this working? Yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah. I'm back to this question of context, but I want to say more about why this struggle was very important in the Black community, because the opposition approached Black churches, particularly one of the ones that was almost operating like a cult here, run by a man named Fozart, who had come from Greensboro out of jail, I think he was in jail for rape, but he had a sizable congregation here, and he put kids, 14-year-olds, on these tables to take names. And these white supremacist folks had approached him to basically shut down the response in the Black community. Well, this was not the first time in our experience of organizing on justice issues that this has occurred. And so it's occurred in labor. There was a place in Greensboro called B&C Associates, who were basically hired by companies to go in and pretty much intimidate and threaten any workers who had filed for discrimination complaints or were trying to organize as a union. And so for us, this element to have influence on our work was also a major threat that had to be beat back. And so that was one of the dynamics. And I don't know if, I was trying to get to it to make it clear, but this was a very racially divided community. Now, we all kind of knew each other personally, not necessarily because we were in the same organizations or stuff, but you should recognize how different that experience was and how the networks within different communities were really unknown to others. So Mab talking about kind of the isolation of the gay community at that time speaks to some of that. So I just want to say, if today, based on what we know about organizing, a proclamation would never mention only one sector that's under attack. You would lift up the names and the challenges of other sectors under attack, whether it's trans children, immigrant rights, school teachers, librarians, all the people now that are facing this onslaught of fascism in our country. And so I just say that because, not to diminish the importance of this, but if you're trying to build up not only learning but support within the community, you have to lift up everybody.
I'd just like to add to that, Eddie. I mentioned earlier about calling Bishop Lewis, and it was clear to me it was very crucial that he come on board and that we have a representative from the black community. And we had other colleagues, too. He wasn't the only one. But you need to realize that this was a very, very divided religious community. We had 75 clergy people that signed it, but there were 106 religious organizations that were supporting the recall. So, David Fozard was one of the leading people in the black community who was opposing us, and he and I encountered each other several times. It wasn't sweet, but anyway.
But let me just say this, that there were several leaders in the black community that signed that petition that Joe Harvard put out there. And some of those names that will be folks that you all would recognize. W.W. Easley, who was the pastor at the Great St. Joseph AME Church. Percy High, who was the pastor at Mount Vernon. J.C. Cheek, who was the pastor at Mount Calvary, Mount Calvary, and Paul Jackson, who was at First Calvary. Johnny Lee, Jeannie Lucas, who later became a St. Lucas, so there were several influential black leaders who took the reins and said, the other group does not speak for all of the black community. So it was a very courageous position for many of these people to take.
Eddie, thank you for raising those names up. Those were strong leaders, and they came forward.
That's right. Well, you corralled them. I think we have time for just a few other people. And while you're deciding what your comments will be, let me recognize some of the elected officials that we have in the audience today. I see Michelle Burton, who is a member of the Durham County Board of Commissioners. I see Carl Risk, who is a member of the Durham City Council. I see Marsha Moray, who is a member of the maybe I got State House. Maybe I thought that was her. Okay. I thought it was her. Okay. Are there any other elected officials here? Judge Kendra Montgomery Glenn. Thank you very much for being here. And all of you all are important too. Are there any final comments? Yes.
I can probably yell. I'm curious, what sorts of spaces were you having these organizing conversations in and things like that? Like, were there libraries you would go to? Was it just offices that you were doing it at? I know now we have a lot more virtual technology and things, but people feel more disconnected than ever. And I think it's a lot more easy to collaborate in person. So I was just curious about like where you were doing that.
I think it varied. Go ahead.
605 building.
604, but also the old YW on Proctor Street.
But the thing is, I would characterize this as an inclusive campaign
but it was not a coalition. It was not an organizational structure that contained it. So no matter where we were, there are various places that people connected, both in meetings and one-on-one. But you raise a very important point, which is, in that day,
Oh, I'm sorry. In that day in organizing, we were looking at each other in the eye. You know, Southerners have this way of wanting to see what you do and what you say. You know, what you say and what you do, kind of thing. But today, the lack of that, so I think the challenge today, this is one of the questions I wanted to put you all, was thinking about what spaces you can create that enable the community to actually come together and build relationships. And particularly, especially now that we have some public officials in here, what will the role of the city of Durham be to protect this community?
Hi, I just wanted to ask whether the public schools, I'm an educator, or was, and I've been very disturbed by the legislature and what they're doing in the public schools to divide our children and keep their history from them already now again. And I was wondering if the schools played a role back then and if the school board stood up at all, or just basically that.
I don't recall any role. Eddie, you will know for sure.
I don't think the schools officially played a role. There were people in the schools who did it. Things are different now. Almost every high school, at least, has a gay lesbian task force or coalition with allies there. So things have changed and for the benefit. But you raised a good point about how the General Assembly can do all kinds of things, and I would guess that we should be aware and on the lookout for things that come out of Raleigh that might try to hinder not only DEI, but also any clubs and organizations that would meet on school campuses. And that's a shame because there are many children who are in our schools who need that kind of sheltering and coalitions.
Eddie, can I say something about the spaces?
Yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to, I was just thinking a little bit about your question about the spaces. And a couple people mentioned it from the audience, but I think it was really important that we didn't call them co-working spaces, but the 604 building, 604 West Chapel Hill Street, which people have mentioned, where there were a lot of progressive organizations were based there and were working together. On 9th Street, we had, you know, there was the bookstore, and African News was downstairs, and then up the street was Perg and Enkosh. I mean, there was, you know what, yeah, and I like to think of it as kind of, you know, like sort of like the praxis axis. I mean, we knew each other, and we did have spaces in which to meet. There was a union hall on 9th Street. On 9th Street, there was a union hall. So, and then Carol mentioned the Y. The YWCA, in these notes, we're meeting at the Y. And, yeah. It's, I can't remember what's there it's now, but it's between, Camelot Academy is there. It used to be the Y. And so there were a lot of meetings there, and they were very welcoming. So I think those spaces were important.
I want to give a shout out to Laura in the library, because at one point we had the pro was meeting at the library to organize, and the con was meeting at the library to organize, which is the perfect role of a library in a community. And thank you for having us here today.
Couple of other hands, yes. Yes.
Right now, with the beginning of this new administration, we have kind of a climate in which the top leadership is trying to fundamentally change people's opinions about who LGBT people are, who black people are, who working class people are, who immigrants are, and kind of change their minds about, you know, the way that they're valued. So I have a question for Mab Segrest about how do we start a conversation with folks who might be kind of open to this kind of attempt to totally fundamentally change the nation's values? You know, how do we start like a one-on-one conversation with one of these possible neighbors, for example? Thank you.
Well, on Easter, I started going to the Baptist church in my neighborhood, which for old-time Methodist, long-time lesbian, Buddhist, and Unitarian was a big step because I wanted to like engage, you know, like I like to talk to people who agree with me, you know, but to really, that was my example of really putting myself out, having to get to know people again, you know, like remembering, I mean, and I went back partly because I had been furious for years at people who misuse Jesus to do all these mean things, and I'm starting with my sister and I'm going on out, you know, and it occurred to me, if I'm so mad about Jesus, I might want to go back to church, you know, so I can't say that for everybody. And I think it's an important issue because the recall kind of really stirred the pot. And it was totally accidental. I mean, the gay organizers didn't say, and then we'll have a recall, and oh, yay, all this stuff happened. You know, it just happened. But the moment was ripe for it. And I do think, I mean, it is incredible the amount of damage this administration is attempting to do in such a compressed period of time to so many people. I mean, and many of the people who voted for him are really going to be taken by surprise. And so I think there's lots of opportunities to raise those questions. Is this what you voted for? And what about, you know, like to have different kind of commonalities? I don't know the structure for it. I'm not sure we have the structure for it. It's not the Democratic Party. And maybe we've relied to, you know, like, but how do we do that? And maybe we need to get together too and do some thinking on that. And as Leah said, find out what's on the ground, what's happening. I mean, we know them in our families. White people, we know them in our families. We don't have to go too far, I don't think, to find some folks who are doing that. And I have really strained myself to keep a relationship with my sister because she's one of those people, you know. So I think it's an excellent question. And I think it's a question that we need to answer together. And there's a lot of different organizations. You know, I mean, I know the Unitarians are putting together a faith table to try to take on some of this stuff. So, you know, I think it's a good question for everybody. But thank you very much for the question.
I'd like to say a couple of things in response to that question. One of which is when we were trying to deal with the intentional relationship building between immigrants and the African American community, what we had to do was create settings for people, not big groups, small groups of people come together and tell their stories. So then, like, when we were in a union hall in Durham, and this 13-year-old girl describes to people in the room about how she crossed the border by herself with a coyote and folks trying to find her mom who was over here and she missed her. And it, you know, people's personal stories are gripping, but also there's so much misinformation. So at this time, like in '82, there were like 2 million people in the world in flux. Now it's much greater. And only 2% were coming to the US. So people feel bombarded here and don't realize there are all these forces that have forced people to move out of their comfort zone, their homes, a lot of which is caused by American policy, both financial and trade, economic policies. But the point is, the way that the administrations go at this is the victims are the problem. Let's get rid of them. Let's make them be expendable. Let's demonize them. They're criminals. And this is a pattern not just in the US, this is happening in Europe. So this is the problem that we have to overcome of how when you listen to people, you can break through some of that stuff. But now with what the internet does, it's a big challenge. And that's why I was saying this has really got to be intentional and urgent work as the starting point.
This This has been a scrumptious meal, and we want to leave you wanting more. So there will be other opportunities for us to get together to talk about this particular incident and other things that went on in Durham in the 80s and beyond. Thank you so much. Thank the library. Thank all of the people who organized and all of the things, and thank the audience for being here. Thank you for drive safely. We'll see you next time.